Okay, everybody, it's 1:30 or very close to it. Welcome to the Capital Sustainability Steering Committee for Tuesday, May the 7th. I'll call this meeting to order. I need a motion to adopt the agenda. Councillor Davidson, all those in favor? Opposed? That carries. Disclosure of pecuniary interest or the general nature thereof. Okay. And adoption of previous minutes. We have one, and they're exciting, these minutes. Okay, Councillor Davidson, all those in favor? Opposed? That carries. Okay, delegations, we have none. We have one item of scheduled business, and this is going to be a presentation by Gigi Lee, Financial Services and Treasurer, Michelle Dobby, Manager of Parks and Natural Heritage Planning, and Bob Levesque, Director of Infrastructure Delivery. And this is a 35-minute presentation or somewhere thereabouts. So we'll start, I think, probably with Gigi.
Good afternoon, Mayor West and members of the committee. Today is the third of its series of Capital Sustainability Steering Committee meetings where we continue with the overarching objective of presenting relevant background information to the committee to help inform the development of financial strategies and to manage the capital program and funding to ensure the city's long-term financial sustainability. Next slide, please. In April, Commissioner Steele presented to the committee the Recreation and Culture Master Plan. Comments received from the committee will be used to provide guidance for the North Leslie feasibility study, which is planned for later this year, along with the indoor turf needs assessment and the 2025 budget strategy that will be coming forward in June. Today, we will turn our focus to the Parks Plan, Agenda 6.1, details of the Parks Plan implementation and the 10-year capital forecast for growth. And I hope that this presentation will facilitate some ideas to inform the committee discussions. As with the Recreation and Culture Master Plan, comments received today will be referred back to staff for consideration in the 2025 capital budget planning process. In the previous meeting, we touched on the topic of debt financing. So what I have prepared for today, following the Parks Plan presentation, is that I'll be providing a high-level overview and background on debt financing for discussion purposes. Next slide, please. The 2024 committee meetings are listed on this slide to demonstrate the progress we've made, but also what we can expect over the coming months and the topics that will be coming forward for discussion. We have completed the Rec and Culture Plan meeting, as you see, that was done on April 16th. Today, we'll focus on the parks and related master plans. With that, I'll turn it over to Manager Dobby to go over the Parks Plan implementation of the presentation.
All right, good afternoon, and thank you for having me, Mayor West and members of the committee. Today, as Gigi said, I'll be presenting on the Parks Plan implementation and the 10-year capital plan forecast for growth-related parks and park revitalization projects. Next slide. As we know, the Parks Plan guides the planning of parkland and outdoor recreational facilities to 2031. It was approved by Council in June of 2022. And the target service levels are established to serve a projected population of 253,000 people in 2031. Next slide. As I noted earlier, this presentation does focus on the growth-related parks and park revitalization projects. So the table that you see kind of across the middle of that slide there is summarizing just those projects, the growth-related park projects and the park revitalization projects. And as you can see kind of at the end of that table, the far right-hand side, the forecast total over the 10-year horizon, so to 2033, is $217 million approximately. This amount is sourced from 3 growth reserves: the Development Charges Reserve, the Cash in Lieu Parkland Reserve, and the Community Benefits Charge Reserve. And the projects implement the planned park system shown on the right-hand side of that slide. That is figure 6.1 from the 2022 Parks Plan. Next slide. The $217 million worth of projects will allow the city to provide many new parks across our growing areas. So that green bar at the top of the slide is how many different park projects there are, accounting for 59% of the $217 million total. Largely, those are located in North Leslie, West Gormley, and the growing Yonge Street corridor. The three parks across the bottom of the slide represent the most costly projects in the forecast. They take up 41%. So the remaining of the balance of the funds is Richmond Hill DDO is accounting for 24%, Town Park Revitalization and Unity Park Repair and Replacement 7%, and Mill Pond Park Revitalization 10%. Next slide. So this pie chart shows the funding splits between the main reserves. And as you can see from the orange on this graph, development charges is the main funding source at 54%. And then second to that, in the dark blue color, is cash in lieu of parkland at 29%. Next slide. This graph is the same graph that you saw in April during Commissioner Steele's presentation. So as was explained then, it shows a shortfall in the development charge reserve in 2028. That's where you can see the peach color dipping down. And that is also the same time when in the planned forecast right now, the North Leslie Community Center begins construction. Those are the light green bars on that slide that start in 2028. So I would say just remember this slide as our funding challenge number one, while I start to talk about the next two slides, which is the second funding challenge. Next slide. The Parks Plan establishes both the land and outdoor recreation facility needs to 2031. So that's 2 years less than our forecast, which goes to 2033, as we know. And as you can see at the bottom of this slide, we are planning for an additional 53.3 hectares. At the time of the Parks Plan, we had secured 24.23 hectares of that land need, again, largely in North Leslie and West Gormley, the new growth areas. And we still have another 29.33 hectares to secure. When we did the analysis for the Parks Plan, that was equated to $411 million worth of land need. That was in 2021 dollars. Next slide. So this slide shows what is our second funding challenge. It may not look like a challenge at first because there is a lot of peach above the line, as you can see. But that estimated funding available for parkland acquisition is hovering around $60 million to 2033, which is much less than the $411 million calculated to be needed for the 29 hectares that we still need to secure. This is largely resulting from the Bill 23 funding challenges. Next slide. So just thinking about those two challenges together, there's a number of risks and challenges that the city needs to consider before we decide how to mitigate these funding challenges. And I'll just highlight a few of them because there's a lot of text on this slide. So just to, the first one is the ability to acquire the unsecured parkland that we need to 2031. The new land-based caps established through Bill 23 will limit us in that regard, and also the ability to actually acquire and purchase new land. There just isn't a lot of land available for purchase right now. Secondly, the need to continue to revitalize our aging parks, particularly along the growth corridor. We do have a different demographic moving into that area, as well as a lot of new population. So it is important to continue to think about revitalizing those older parks to serve the new growing areas. We also have a few of our bylaws are still under appeal before the Ontario Land Tribunal, so that will limit us a bit. There could be future impacts to the development charge service level standards and future funding, depending on what we decide to fund off the development charges reserve in the future. We have some additional funding constraints not captured for recent projects. So within that $217 million in the forecast right now, there's two projects listed on the slide there, the Civic Lands Passive Park design and construction and the Gormley Go land lease, which are not captured right now. And then lastly, cost inflation is affecting everything these days. So just on the next slide there, I have an example of that as it relates to the Richmond Hill DDO project. And Bob is here if anyone has any specific questions on RHDDO. This slide just shows an example of the cost inflation challenges for RHDDO between 2019 and 2024. So as you can see in that middle column there, the cost for the early, medium, and late-term projects in 2019, $74 million. Now it is up to $121 million. Next slide. So that was a lot of information to consider, but these next slides are what I think is the fun part, at least for me as a planner. There's 4 scenarios that we'd like to hear your input on today. These are not fully analyzed yet. They're just intended, as Gigi said, to start the conversation about how the city could go about mitigating the funding challenges, again, largely resulting from Bill 23. And 3 things that we'd like to hear from you when we get to the discussion part. If you like a scenario and why, if you don't like a scenario and why, and which scenario you feel best implements the city's vision. And then this will help with the capital budget strategy for this year. Next slide. So our first scenario, we always have this status quo. This is the do nothing option. What is going to happen if we do nothing? The red bubble that is on this slide kind of shows the real impact of doing nothing. In 2028, we will dip into the red. Our reserves will be depleted. And we will either have to find alternative funding or consider debt financing in order to do any projects that are park or indoor recreation related post 2028. Next slide. Scenario B, this is a scenario where we consider deferring portions of projects or extending timeframes. So just some examples of things we could consider. Just deferring the last phase of the master plan projects that we looked at earlier, those big projects that are taking up a lot of our funding envelope right now. We could defer construction of the North Leslie Community Center to further out in the forecast or consider phasing it. We could also extend the timeframes of the master plan phases further across the capital plan forecast. And I have a slide that is an example of this on the next slide. So if people who were here remember back to the 2019 Capital Sustainability Steering Committee, one of the outputs at that time was to extend the timeframes for the implementation of Richmond Hill DDO. And at that time, the project was refocused on implementing just the passive park elements to get the project going and to allow people to be able to use the park. That was over a longer time frame than initially anticipated as a cost-saving measure. Next slide. Scenario C is about using reserve funds or alternative financing. So just as an example, we could consider foregoing some of the land securement, so some of that 29 hectares that we still need to secure in order to use some of the money in the cash in lieu reserve fund to fund either growth-related park projects or recreation projects. Next slide. This is the last scenario. This one is about adjusting the scope and scale of new growth park projects and park revitalization projects and the North Leslie Community Center. So just some of the things we could consider doing, continuing to design and build cost-effective parks, so carrying forward that direction from the 2019 Capital Sustainability Steering Committee. We could consider removing certain planned facilities from our new growth parks and our park revitalization projects. We could also consider removing certain components from the planned North Leslie Community Center, which Commissioner Steele spoke to back in April. And just some of the items are there listed for you in the parenthesis. Next slide. This is my last slide, then I'm handing it back to Gigi. This is just an example of one potential combination of scenario B, C, and D. And it is including phasing or debt financing the North Leslie Community Center. So you can see the light green bars in 2028 are showing less money than in the previous graph that you saw in the do nothing scenario. And it is also reducing the capital forecast for growth related park projects while using alternative funding. So you can see this extends our funding challenge to 2029 on the graph when the peach starts to dip below the line, below the zero line again. And it also decreases the funding gap that results post 2029. It's not dipping down as far as it did before. So with that, I'm going to hand it back to Gigi, who will provide some additional information on debt financing.
The City of Richmond Hill has maintained a strong financial position for many years and has been successful at efficiently managing its finances without the issuance of debt. Reserves and reserve fund balances have been accumulated throughout the years through the wise and effective management in all of the city's financial resources. However, aging infrastructure and a growing community require an alternative source of financing to maintain and support that future growth. The image that you see on the slide here was the cornerstone of the financial sustainability strategy that was approved by Council in 2020. Essentially, is the idea that to achieve fiscal or financial sustainability is a three-pronged approach. It requires managing the city's capital program and service levels, as well as maintaining sufficient balances in the capital-related reserve funds to provide funding to sustain the infrastructure while utilizing debt as part of a long-term financial sustainability strategy. Financial sustainability requires long-term planning in a fiscally responsible manner that realizes the city's strategic plan priorities while mitigating both short as well as long-term financial risks. Next slide, please. Why take on debt, you may ask? Most municipalities are experiencing the financial pressures from a growing community and limited revenue sources. A municipality will be in a fiscally sustainable position when it can offer the level of service that it can accommodate the long-term needs of the community while maintaining infrastructure in a state of good repair. However, that cost has to be balanced with taxation. One of the financial principles of the city and the goal for capital financing is to first maximize all funding that are external, so from external sources like grants and development charges, before utilizing and looking internally at our the city's own revenue sources, either through operating contributions or other contributions, and then lastly, debt. Next slide, please. As I mentioned earlier, the intent of this overview is to provide background and for general understanding of debt financing, but not so much about the mechanics or the detailed process of it. So what I have on this slide, as you can see, is really highlighting what the Municipal Act allows at the very top. So under the Municipal Act, it does allow municipalities to issue debt or debentures for capital investments. So as you can see, to build or rehabilitate infrastructure assets that are used to provide municipal services. Under a two-tier government structure, like ourselves, within York Region, it's actually the upper tier that would issue the debenture. So when Richmond Hill, Markham, or Vaughan have any debenture needs, they would go through the region to issue that. Debt charges. The Municipal Act also provides or prescribes the allowance of debt that a municipality can take on. As you can see on the slide, it's 25% of our own source revenue. So on an annual basis, the province provides an update on what that annual repayment limit is. So for example, I would receive an update every year from the province as to what our limit would be, looking at what our revenue sources are. Last but not least, the term of financing. It cannot exceed the lesser of 40 years or the useful life of the asset. So for example, if a municipality is to go out to debenture for, let's say, a major road rehabilitation project, it would be the useful life of that asset. So if the road or that component or segment of the road has a 25 years useful life, then the debt financing will be capped at 25 years. So as you can see, it has different sorts of limitations and requirements that are within the Municipal Act when it comes to debt financing. At our previous meeting, we also touched upon the types of debt financing. As you can see on the slide, we categorize them between external and internal. External debt includes obligation for the repayment of funds. So these are usually debentures through the region or external debt through a financing agency. Internal financing, it's borrowing from within our reserves or reserve funds with a commitment to pay back, but also with interest. Next slide, please. So on this slide, I have highlighted the benefits of debt financing, and we already talked about some of them at our last meeting. So some of the benefits include allowing for the distribution of costs over the life of assets, as I talked about on the previous slide, and also for intergenerational equity. At times, we also want to borrow and debt finance to accelerate the timing of a DC-funded growth project. So on the earlier slide, we talked about potentially shifting out, deferring, or debt financing North Leslie. So in those situations, that's where I would call potentially or perhaps a good debt, because any growth-related debt, the servicing charge or the interest that's associated with it would be funded from development charges as well. So it doesn't touch the tax base. Anything that's related to growth, it goes back onto DCs. So there is no impact to property taxes. Another example or benefit of debt financing is when we talk about large capital infrastructure that perhaps does not have another funding source. And I would use the example of the Civic Precinct, a project that the city contemplated a few years back. So at the time, we did contemplate on having debt financing to fund or finance for a portion of the unfunded costs of that project. It's also beneficial and viable to debt finance projects that have perhaps an immediate investment, but that would generate future operational savings. One example I would give is a few years back, the city took on the project, which was the LED conversion project. So there was an initial investment. So we did borrow internally at the onset so that we're able to proceed with the project. And then we also looked at the repayment following that. And the reason why we did that was we knew that with that upfront investment, even though we're spending that money upfront, having to pay the interest, it's about the long-term future operational savings that we would have in the operating budget. Last but not least, to reduce the infrastructure gap. So we've had different meetings. We've talked about the tax-supported capital program and the gap within that infrastructure type and assets that would require eventual borrowing to make sure that we're able to maintain our infrastructure in a state of good repair. Next slide, please. So what are the downsides or the challenges or risks when it comes to debt financing? Well, borrowing poses risk when the credit changes, when the credit conditions change. So when the city adopted the debt policy that was back in 2015, it was during a time when interest rates were historically low. So at the time, we looked at potential debt borrowing. We did not proceed with it, but essentially this bullet, it's really to stress the point that when we're borrowing, there are risks that are associated with it because credit conditions change. So we are living in an environment right now where interest rates are high. Not as high as the 20 or 18% back in the late 80s or early 90s, but within the last 10 to 15 years, I would say we're at the highest level. Also, one of the challenges is we need to make sure that we're maintaining and enforcing fiscal discipline, recognizing when borrowing is appropriate so that we're minimizing any impact on tax rates or the rate supported program. Again, is the idea that we need to be disciplined and have a framework as to what is appropriate for debt financing. And then the other bullets I've touched on briefly, it is about finding that optimal level and making sure that we continue to have a prudent fiscal strategy. The repayment of non-DC debt, as I mentioned earlier, is an operating budget pressure. So aside from growth or DC-related debt that is eligible to be put back onto DCs and future development charges, any debt financing that the city takes on, be it related to the tax-supported program, be it related to water, wastewater, or stormwater, that will impact the future rates. And last but not least, it is the ongoing debt management. Next slide, please. So I touched on some of these questions earlier. So what is appropriate for debt financing? And that is part of the discussions that we're going to be having through the CSSC, as well as future discussions on whether the committee as well as council have the desire or the appetite to consider debt financing. Obviously, we would want to talk about some of the framework as well as the criteria for projects to be considered for debt financing. Just to put it all in the Richmond Hill context, as of today, very happy to share, and as you would know already, that the city is one of the very few municipalities as of right now that is debt-free. So Richmond Hill continues to manage its finances very effectively without having to utilize debt. Also, to put in some context, back in 2015, council did approve the debt policy, but we did not proceed with any debenturing or debt financing. Further to the debt policy that was approved in 2015, as part of the financial sustainability strategy that was approved in 2020, staff also worked on a debt management strategy. So essentially furthering down to develop the framework on what some potential projects may be to be considered and looking at what that process may be. And then last but not least, as part of the CSSC review, as you can see throughout the last two presentations, we have talked about potentially debt financing. So we will be revisiting the debt management strategy as part of the work that we're doing within the CSSC. Next slide, please. In terms of next steps, the comments that we received today will be used to assess and to look at the mitigating strategies for discussion. And that will also help guide the 2025 budget strategy that will be presented back to the CSSC in June, as well as BC. Next slide. So that concludes our presentation, and we'll open it up for comments and discussions. Mayor West.
Okay, thank you very much. So members of committee and others that are here, thank you for being here. This is, I think this is probably one of the most important discussions that we're going to be having in this term of council. You know, we are at a very significant fork in the road, I think, and we need to figure out how we're going to best manage what we need to do over the next little while, given all the pressures that we are under right now. You know, and a number of those pressures actually are coming from outside of the municipality, but you know, we are where we are. We've never, you know, shied away from a challenge, and I think we've certainly got a challenge here. So I'm thankful to staff for the thorough analysis that we've been presented with. So to kick it off, I think Councillor Silovitz has her hand up, and then Regional Local Councillor DePaulo after that.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you to everybody on staff for this presentation and all the reports we've read. There's so much work that goes into this, so thank you. I just have a few comments. So on slide 14, you wanted us to comment whether we like something, whether we don't, best implementation, and what's for the city's vision. So for scenario A, in my opinion, do nothing is not acceptable. because the more you do nothing, the greater your chance of that do nothing becoming an absolute flood. So I don't, you can't stop up a hole leaking water if the rains continue to fall. So it's a very difficult question to answer, but I believe it's also quite straightforward. We cannot not do nothing. With regards to scenario B, the only, with all respect to Councillor Davidson, the only thing I can think of is with B is the North Leslie Community Centre. And she actually, Councillor Davidson, has made some really, really good comments in this regard about should we or should we not defer the building of the North Leslie Community Centre. Is it actually needed? There's so many things to consider here. It's how quick will everybody be moving in? How quick will a community centre be needed? As Councillor Davidson has specified, there are other community centres that can be utilised in the interim. So I think that perhaps the North Leslie Community Centre, gets a red flag from me. And then with scenario C, in my opinion, land securement is essential. If we do not secure land that is necessary for us to have some more green space and parks, we could lose that land. So I don't believe it would be anywhere anything to gain should we think about not securing land. While it might be expensive, I believe it is an investment into the sustainability of the city and its residents. So land securement to me is essential. And then on scenario D, again, it's the North Leslie Community Centre. So I think whatever we can do without severely negatively impacting the North Leslie community and growth, I think that we should perhaps consider that. To me, that's something that is standing out. With regards to debt financing, can you tell me, through you, Mr. Chair, to our treasurer, you don't speak about any kind of capital sustainability levies that we could put onto the tax roll in this regard. Is that because we're not allowed to do that in order to fund these types of things, or is it because it's just not being considered here at this time?
Through the chair to Councillor Sullivan. So currently we do have the capital asset sustainability levy, and that's at 1.5%. That is at this point a levy that is dedicated to tax supported capital. So it's not related to debt, not related to any other projects other than to fund for projects that would be otherwise funded from tax. So this levy is the funding that is generated that go towards the tax supported reserve funds to then fund for the tax supported capital program.
So would through you, Mr. Chair, thank you. Through you, Mr. Chair. So what I'm thinking of is if you put another tax levy onto the tax roll in order to help us overcome some of the difficulties we are going to face. Is that not advisable, or can the current levy be rolled into something else? I'm sure we must be under enormous constraints with regards to financing and banking by the provincial government in the region.
Through the mayor to Councillor Sullivan. So I think that is always an option should council decide to pursue. However, as noted by the councillor, we do have a number of different financial constraints. You know, a separate levy essentially is another tax. So, you know, again, I go back to there are other priorities as well, and there are other constraints within the operating budget. So I think this would be another one that would go on to what's already a pretty full plate when it comes to financial decisions and choices that we have to make.
Thank you, Madam Treasurer. I appreciate that. For now, those are all my comments. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Okay, thank you very much. Regional Local Councillor DePaula.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I'm not sure if you're looking for a motion on the floor. I'd happy to make a motion to receive the presentation with thanks, and I don't be reluctant at this point to give other direction, or we need to crystallize the decision. I think our staff's just looking for feedback, comments on what was presented and available for questions. So I had a question from the presentation, the benefits of one of the benefits of debt financing was that you could build the capital asset in such a way that it increases the revenue on an ongoing basis. So something to that effect, and the benefit is that we would build a different I just made that up. Artists of benefit. I'll turn that around. Thought I saw that in there. Not sure if you can answer that, but would
Through the
debt
chair.
financing help us to build a different type of capital asset? No.
Through the chair, I can make an attempt. Perhaps it's the one where I talked about the upfront investments. And that where we would debt finance or borrow to make that upfront investments so that over the longer term, we would be able to generate future savings within the operating budget. So I use the LED conversion project as an example where we would upfront the project, but in future
Right.
years, we'll recognize those savings in the operating budget.
Okay, so but that could occur with or without debt financing, right? We could still have those same upfront investments, generate the future operational savings.
With that example, we did use internal borrowing. Right, so we are having to upfront and pay for that project ahead of time. So that we can recognize the savings in the future. In this particular situation, what had happened was we did use internal borrowing, so we borrowed from one of our own reserve funds to kick off the project. And then later down the road, this was also deemed to be eligible for then the federal gas tax. So we're able to then use that money to pay back our own reserves.
Okay, no, very good. I like that sort of thing. I really think internal borrowing is a very good thing. We have, especially in the interest rate regime that we're facing now. I still don't think that we need to venture into debt financing, and I really like the fact that Richmond is one of the few municipalities that hasn't gone that way yet. There's minimal benefits. I think a lot of it's all just like accounting and financing, the way things are reported. The region, for example, they've borrowed $3 billion, but they also have $3 billion in reserves, and it's just the way they're accounting for things. But politically, they're open to the criticism that they owe $3 billion, so that they borrowed $3 billion, and they could have done things differently. I understand the rationale, but politically, it's really sensitive to do that. And And on the other hand, it really sends a good message, and there's the political or the perception benefit that we're doing an excellent job because we have not had to borrow. I see it as truly a last resort that we get there. I think the options of deferring projects or simply expanding the time frame that projects are delivered, actually through you, Mr. Mayor, to our Commissioner of Infrastructure. Do you have a timeline on that North Leslie Community Center? Is it not really some years off before the need is generated? Sorry, okay.
Through you, Mr. Chair, I'll answer that one. Because the need for the community center is really determined through the Recreation and Culture Master Plan, and our ability to, if you think back to last week, there was a table that I showed of the service levels for the individual components within the facility. So we provide, for example, pools when one per every, or it's around 30,000 people. So when our population hits that amount, that's what triggers that need. So right now it's sitting in the capital plan to start construction in 2028. But I definitely agree that given that North Leslie and West Gormley are proceeding a little more slowly than expected, that we need to reassess that population-based need.
Thank you. Yeah. So it's already scheduled to be some time off, to not even begin 4 years from now. And that might be slower based on the residents moving in. I know that residents moving in the area is not the sole factor. The determining factor is more the recreation facility needs that we have. And we could probably benefit if that was there today. With the pressure on our other facilities. But I have a strong preference towards delaying, deferring, or even adjusting the project scope for those major projects before going into debt financing. That's my preference. And then I still, it was an excellent presentation, and it really outlines the situation that we're faced with, and it takes into account the different options that we could do with existing money. But I still think we're not exploring other revenue opportunities. I still think we're not putting hard decisions on the table and other options of maybe selling some city-owned land that's not suitable for a park, or other thing. I think we still have some surplus real estate that we can generate money, or there's other ways and other things we can do to continue to at least defer that need for debt financing at this stage. Thanks, Mr. Mayor.
No, thank you very much. Good discussion. So the next person is Councillor Davidson.
Thank you, and thank you to staff. Through you, Mr. Chair, the two things that I want to say first is the acquiring land. I feel like that is the #1 priority, because once it's gone, it's gone. So however the plan fits with what we have, I feel like getting the land first is what we have to do before we start to decide what we put on it, because if we don't take the opportunities now, we're seeing a lot of land disappear in Richmond Hill. Less and less is available, and I think we need to secure land first. What's available. And the second thing that I really want to say is, for sure, I also look at debt financing as a last resort. People who are established and have home for years have scrambled to renegotiate their mortgages in the last couple of years, because a 3% increase or 4% makes a world of difference. And I would love to not have us in the position that it would be worrisome should interest rates really change. So if we were looking at a household, the way I would run it would be, let's try to live within our means, and what can we do without, rather than financing something we can't afford. And I really hope that the new Gormley neighborhood gets everything that every other neighborhood in Richmond Hill is entitled to. I go by there often, and it's not a huge population. If we stick to, as long as I'm sitting here, I would like us to keep the green spaces, which to me says that West Gormley is a contained neighborhood. It's not, in my mind, if we keep the green areas green, and since that area is going to be delisted as an MTSA, that neighborhood's not going to grow like a fire, because it's surrounded by land that is designated to not be developed that way. So I'm not clear on what our plan is for that neighborhood, just the streets that are there, or are we looking at if we opened up the whole area, which I hope we don't. So I'd like a more thorough understanding. We can do this offline of what the plan is for that neighborhood, because it's not huge. And maybe they don't need all the bells and whistles because it's not as big. It's also very close to Lake Wilcox Community Center. It's just down Leslie from Richmond Green. So I agree with adjusting scale, and I agree with deferral ideas rather than going into debt. But I do say our number one priority is acquiring the land. And the other thing is, politics can change a lot, in 2026 and the next year. What's the province doing? So I like that we're making decisions thinking, okay, if nothing changed in terms of development charges and funding, I'm really hoping we can stay away from loading up the property taxes, because MPAC hasn't done an assessment since 2016. So people are going to get big jumps in their tax bill, which won't bring in any more money. But for some residents, there's going to be a huge change in what they pay when MPAC does reissue valuations for properties, because things have changed since 2016. So I think we need to be mindful of all the pressures that will be on our residents. And I hope we can live within our means, not finance debt, and not put a huge load onto taxpayers, and figure out how to work with what we have. Those are my comments. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Regional Local Councillor Chan.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, staff, for putting a very comprehensive presentation. It's always good to have choices. Scenario A to D is obviously down the road, maybe E, F, G, and G. To begin with, I just want to very clear, I'm taking this debt financing 101 through Mr. Chair. Is borrowing considered as debt financing? Well, in a sense, the debenture is borrowing, but depending from whom. So I see the answer yes. And then what about Infrastructure Canada in the CIB, Canadian Infrastructure Bank? And I believe Ontario budget also talking about setting up something similar, or we already have one, Infrastructure Ontario. So rather than debenture, my understanding is going to the market, so to speak. Is that, through you, Mr. Chair, perhaps your treasurer, is borrowing from presumably a lower rate than the commercial market, with CIB, Canadian Infrastructure Bank, or Infrastructure Ontario, or the like, the consideration, or even some pension funds?
Through the chair to Regional and Local Councillor Chan. So that is still considered debt financing, right? So the debt financing, the way I would describe it is the borrowing of money and having that obligation to repay it over the next 10, 15, 20 years, whatever the term may be. So whether it's internal, whether it's external, whether it's through a debenture, through the region, through Infrastructure Ontario, Infrastructure Canada, they're all the same. They may have some more competitive rates. We haven't been keeping up with the rates for obvious reasons, because we don't currently have debt. But definitely when we were doing the benchmarking and research, we did find that the IO rates were slightly more competitive compared to the bank rates.
Thank you. I'm not suggesting go to debt financing at this point in time. However, I'm just saying saying that there are sources that make it a bit more competitive in terms of the just going to the private market for debentures. So it's not unlike in some way, and just doing our family budget, so to speak. And reference has been made to paying mortgages, things of that nature. I mean, it seems to be no-brainer or something is that, okay, defer fixing the whatever in your house for a longer period of time. But of course, the risk is whatever that the wear and tear maintenance would require. So help me understand on specific on scenario C on slide 18. Utilize reserve funds or alternative funding. Is it how much more reserve funds we can tap into? Just roughly ballpark. Another 30 million? Because it doesn't say anything about the dollar amount, although there is a graph like this, but help me understand, through Mr. Chair.
Through the mayor. So essentially, scenario C is the scenario where we would utilize funding that we have in a reserve fund, such as the cash in lieu of parkland or the CEEV, which is the Community Enhancement and Economic Vitality Reserve Fund. So those are reserve funds that we have that have a fairly healthy balance. So in the illustrative example that we provided, which is the updated graph, we did assume approximately, I believe, $27 million. And that's why you see that if we can go to slide 20, I believe.
Yeah.
Yeah, so essentially what has been used as part of the illustrative example is that there is a 3 million annual contribution from an alternative funding source to help smooth out, to provide at the additional funding. So approximately 27.
Thank you. And I think the size matters in this case in terms of how much money we get left. What you're referring to, I remember correctly, is the pool of money is back from almost over 20 years ago when the town of Richmond then sold the Richmond Hydro, and part of those money is still being streamed. So I got it. But alternative funding on the same slide 18, scenario C. Alternative funding meaning borrowing? I'm just trying to understand because scenario D is talking about then actually go out to get borrowing. So what would be alternative funding? Sorry, through you, Mr. Chair, on slide 18.
So alternative funding could mean the CEV that I mentioned, or using cash in lieu of parkland. So we did have that discussion in the last meeting where we said perhaps we could, because the act does provide for it, that perhaps we dip into that reserve to offset some of the potential shortfalls here. Alternative funding could also be grant and other things as well. So it's really the idea that under this scenario, we're looking further to other opportunities so that we were able to inject more revenues into this area to help support the parks that are in the forecast, as well as the North Leslie. So going back to the illustrative example, you also see that we've moved out North Leslie, right? So it is intended to show that it will take a combination of doing all the things that we have mentioned to be able to move the mark or at least to consider them so that we will have a more sustainable program for this area.
Thank you. Councilor Silver's, she's currently the chair of the Richmond Hill DDO project committee. I guess I myself, I always have soft spot and emotionally attached to that Richmond Hill David Dunham Observatory. We have talked about delaying it for quite a number of times of the early, medium, and longer term. I see now it runs even up to 15 years. It's a very good chance I would not be sitting here at that time, but I hate to see that keep delaying. And the same applies to North Leslie. So like I have trouble with thinking about scenario B because we tried that actually during the COVID times. I recall when I was still chairing that committee, we keep saying, come back, come back, come back. And in the meantime, that surprise, surprise, we got money along the way, 3 million there, 251,000, whatever for the trail, whatever. And now it's also being a National Historic site. I'm very hopeful, and maybe not the scope for discussion today, at that committee level, perhaps, Councillor Civilis, is that I really like to expand on, at that level, the opportunity to engage other partners, maybe even, somewhat, whatever Foundation Boulevard, Community of Gardens, or something of that line that might help defer the thinking about or offer alternative to simply using only city dollars to defer to do those things. But that's beyond the discussion today. But just maybe at a committee level, that's something to talk about for the Richmond Hill DDO Park. Insofar as the North Leslie Community Center, mentioned scenario B, scenario D, and so on. Oh, sorry, maybe I'll come back a second round. Thank you.
Next. Okay, thank you. Okay, Councillor Shu.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you for the presentation, and Ms. Jennifer and your team for the great effort. It's a lot to do here. We all know that. Much appreciate that. My first question for the chair is also regarding the scenario B, talking about defer portion of projects and extend the time frame. In my opinion, it's tough to see if it's a good way, because on one hand, it seems smart to move fast and dodge cost inflation. But on the other hand, we are in the peak interest rate situation and most likely to drop soon. So which carries more weight? I've totally no idea on this. So any reference to figure out if deferral is the way to go, because I have no idea which factors weight more, cost inflation and to wait for the interest rate to drop soon, which factors will have more impact? Through the chair.
Okay, Ms. Lee, did you get that, or would you like him to restate the question? Michael or Councillor Shu, could you just restate that?
Yeah. Okay. Oh, yeah. My question is talking about the scenario B, is about the deferral, but I have no idea which if it's a good way, because on one hand it seems smart to move fast and dodge cost inflation. But on the other hand, we are in the peak interest rate situation, and most likely the interest rate will drop soon. So which carries more weight?
Okay, hang on one second here. You get the award for the hardest question so far.
Through the chair to Councillor Shu, like I think this is all very speculative, right? So I don't have a crystal ball. Definitely when it comes to cost inflation, I think my colleagues here can confirm that some of the increases that we've been seeing over the last year or so has started to stabilize in terms of costing, right? So I can say that much on the cost side. On the flip side, when it comes to interest rates, definitely the CPI and inflation has been gradually decreasing over the last little while. And there are even speculations that perhaps on June 5th, we will be seeing the first interest rate reduction. I think there's still a lot remain to be seen, because the bank, I'm now starting to talk for the Bank of Canada, which I shouldn't, but there's still a lot that needs to unfold before they can really go in and do that first rate cut, I mean, because they're still having to balance the impact of inflation. What they don't want to do right now is to cut rates too early, and that the inflation rebounds after that. So I think, in my opinion, in my professional opinion, I would say, even if they are to reduce the rates, it'll be very gradual. And it'll be, if not June, but perhaps, later on in the year.
Okay.
I'm not sure if that answered your question, but that's my
know,
best
I-
attempt.
I know it's a tough question because because we don't know the future is so many uncertainty ahead. But this is a crucial factor to make up our mind if deferral is a good option. So maybe maybe we need some more specialists to forecast the economy ahead. Okay. My next question is also about the debt financing. When we borrow from elsewhere, do we usually lock in a fixed interest rate or a variable term? And what's the typical duration for the term of the loan?
Through the chair to Councillor Hsu, so it would be fixed rates. We don't borrow the variable rates. Definitely fixed, and then the duration of the term would depend on what the type of project or the asset that it is. So as I mentioned earlier, there is a 40-year cap. So it's going to be lesser of the 40-year or the useful life of the asset. So I would say typically between 20 to 25 years, depending what the asset is.
Okay, 2025. Got it. For the chair, my next question is referring to the scenario C to utilize the cash in lieu reserve funds. If we allocate this funding to park and recreation related stuff, will it affect other municipal matters such as infrastructure or the maintenance of the old stuff, something like that? Because we can't just look, we can't just focus on parks and recreation, but we have to make a balance for the whole city stuff. So my question is, if we put more reserve fund on parks and recreation, do we neglect the other stuff? For the chair.
Through the chair to Councillor Hsu. So at the moment, we have our cash in lieu of Parkland Reserve Fund. So that reserve fund is essentially funds that we have collected for the acquisition of parkland. And in our previous conversation, in our last meeting, we talked about the amount of parkland that we will need over the next little while. And perhaps we have sufficient land that's already secured that we're able to use this reserve fund to provide for some of the flexibility for some of the parks and rec projects. The other reserve fund was the Community Enhancement and Economic Vitality Reserve Fund that we talked about. So essentially, that was one of the reserve fund that was established from the sale of hydro. Currently, we don't have that earmarked for any specific projects, other than we have been using that reserve fund to help phase in some of the operating programs. So the phasing in of the firefighters over the 4 to 5 years. So we have been using the interest of that reserve to do so, as well as the Public Works Enhancement Program. It was established as an 8-year program, so we've been using the interest plus a little bit of the principal to help phase it into the operating budget. But to answer your question, we don't have any significant projects that have been earmarked, so we're not jeopardizing other projects, so to speak.
Okay, understood. Thank you. Through the chair, my last question is it's about the challenges ahead. On slide 12, we all know we are facing several challenges, especially with those development charges under Bill 23. And recently, the provincial government is introducing Bill 185, which might shake things up with the DC. So considering these potential amendments, it prompts us to assess the overall impact on our park plan. So my question is, are there any significant adjustment required considering these expected changes, Or even do we have to possibly start over the whole parkland because of the new bills coming?
Through the chair to Councillor Xu, with respect to the new bill and legislation, Bill 185 does amend some of the changes that were brought forward by Bill 23 and 134. But essentially what it means is that from the municipality standpoint, the amount of revenue lost will be less. So it's definitely a good news story in that they are proposing within this bill to remove the 5-year mandatory phase-in, as well as the growth-related studies are now once again eligible for DCs. So those are both very positive news for the city. So it's actually going to reduce the impact of Bill 23. So it will be a lesser impact than what was initially forecasted and reported.
Okay, that's all my questions through the chair. Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you. Go ahead, Councillor Thompson.
Thank you very much. Through you, the chair, I do have a couple of questions, and one that actually Councillor Davidson kind of brought to my mind, and that is, during the pandemic, we did a deferral of tax payments, and I believe that recently we've just been advised of a number as to what's outstanding. And I guess my question is, in the charts and graphs that you've shown us here today, has that been accounted for in some way, shape, or form? And if it has it been accounted for in a positive way or in a negative way, depending on our ability to collect on those outstanding taxes?
Through the chair to Councillor Thompson. So no, it won't be impacted because what we're looking at today is the capital related reserve funds, right? So the amount of receivables don't have a direct relationship with the reserve funds and the funding that we've been talking about today. So it's more on the operating side, more about working capital. So it is still fully our plan to make sure we're able to follow through with what we've communicated in terms of addressing that receivable, but has no impact with capital.
Perfect. Thank you very much. Through the chair, I need to get a better understanding of when we borrow from our internal sources here. Do we follow the same rules and regulations that are established if we were going to borrow from an outside source? So in other words, as you're saying, we have a 40-year cap. Depending on the lifespan of the asset, are we building towards the same, length of time of the asset, or can we do other things as well? Do we have to follow exactly what would happen, from an outside source, or do we have some flexibility there?
Through the mayor. So as per the Municipal Act, internal borrowing is allowed. And what I would say in the very little experience that we've had internal borrowing, we have followed through to make sure that we are doing those annual repayments. We're repaying with interest. So in the example that I talked about, which goes back to the LED conversion, it was set up as an 8-year internal borrowing program. And that, same with any other type of borrowing, it was we made sure that we had it set up with the annual repayment date, the interest portion, and things like that. So there may be some flexibility, but definitely we want to make sure that we're setting it up and that we're not losing. We don't have too much flexibility so that we don't want to, we still want to make sure that it's repaid fairly and that the interest portion is captured.
Thank you. And through the chair, so would it be safe to say that the benefits and the risks are essentially the same, no matter, like if we went to an outside source versus the inside source. Like I'm hoping that, it makes the risks are less when we, go internally.
The risks are less, for sure. So if it's an external, obviously you have your repayment schedule and it's going to be more stringent. But as I said earlier, with the experience that we've had, even though there may be some flexibility, we still want to maintain to have that structure so that we're able to continue with our debt management. So yes, there may be some flexibility, but again, we don't want to make it so flexible so that we just say, okay, maybe not this year, maybe the year after. So we are trying to keep up and make sure that it's still very structured. So we're keeping to our commitment and repaying any obligation that it's owed.
Appreciate that. Thank you. Through the chair, we talked a little bit about deferring projects, and I think one of the example of the DDO that Ms. Dobby had provided, it's kind of scary when you look at it. I mean, I'm looking at slide 13, and it's showing how just in 5 years what the dollar difference is between 2019 dollars and 2024 dollars. And so it really does kind of speak to the fact that anything that we can do now seems to make a lot more sense versus pushing it off, because it seems like the costs just get to a point where maybe we can't even do something. So it is something where I think we got to be able to pull out all the stops to do as much as we can, as soon as we can, versus delaying. But that's just my particular thought. There was a comment earlier being made about other assets that we might be able to tap in terms of underutilized assets that we may have. And certainly I would like to see us looking in that direction as well. Those are my comments. Thank you very much for allowing me to add those in.
Okay, thank you. Seeing that there's nobody else on the first round, I'll just make some comments. I agree with, I think, what I'm hearing in a lot of cases here. I mean, I realize that debt financing may be a reality at some point in the future, but I think if we're going to consider it at all, it has to be an absolute last resort, and we would have to really consider it very carefully. Borrowing internally, like we've done a few times, I think actually is a slightly better option. But I think, correct me if I'm wrong, but the problem with borrowing internally is that whatever money we borrow, we're not making interest on, which then is, depending on where we're borrowing it from, would it have an impact on the operating budget? Because some of these reserve funds we use to subsidize our operating budget, right?
To Mayor West, yes, that's correct. So essentially what we have in the reserve fund, those are the balances that we use to invest. So the investment income that we generate is from what we have in the reserve. So the once we start drawing it down, we are in some ways impacting the interest that will be going back into the reserve fund or the operating budget.
Right. So I think we have to remember that. And I mean, I'm not suggesting that that's a deal breaker, but we need to go in with our eyes open. One of the things that we haven't talked about in this, and this is going to make matters worse, not better, is the civic square. And you mentioned that in your presentation. It's not included in any of the calculations. I mean, it's mentioned in the presentation, but it's not captured in the scenarios. I really believe that the civic square is something that is long overdue, and I also believe that it will give the community a great deal of bang for the buck. So I realize that we can't put it in yet because we haven't gone quite through the process to determine how much it's going to cost. But in my mind, I'm always thinking that there needs to be something as a civic square. I think more and more and more as we urbanize, we're going to need parkland on Yonge Street, and we're desperately short of it right now. But I think more than that, we need a place to gather. We've seen many situations over the last little while that we could have utilized that area, and we're not utilizing it because it isn't really developed in any way that would give us a great utilization. But on top of all of that, this project also strikes me as something that we could, build bit by bit. And we don't have to go in and make the whole thing gold plated all at the same time. We can, build a couple of amenities here, a couple of amenities here, so long as we have it planned. So we're not duplicating or ripping things out and then redoing it. But I think this is the attitude that I think we need to start to take with some of our major parks. We have the Mill Pond Park, the Civic Precinct Park, and the Dunlop Observatory Park, where, I don't think deferring things indefinitely is the right way to go. But I think that there needs to be a strategy where we maybe extend some timelines, we maybe do some phasing. We do it in a way that we're not going to be able to do it as quickly as we once hoped that we would be able to do. And the Dunlop Observatory Park is a good example of that. I was on council when we had this fantastic plan that was going to cost a lot of money, and it would be a whole lot more now. And, after the excitement of that wore off, we started to realize even back then that the cost of that is probably going to not be the way that I think most of us would be okay with spending that much money all at once. The other thing is too, I think we need to be looking at these parks and determining like how much use are they getting, how much demand is there, and then prioritizing some of the spending to those places. The Dunlop Observatory Park is quite lovely right now. And I know, we need to continue moving forward step by step by step in the development of that park because the potential is there for it to be a real jewel. But I don't really think that that park is used as much as some of the other parks that we have. And I don't want to pit one park against the other, but I think we need to be looking at this in a more, objective kind of way. So that would be that comment. I think the North Leslie Community Center is going to be needed. It may not be needed as quickly as we thought. Well, it isn't. It hasn't been needed as quickly as we thought because the area has not built out as quickly as we thought, but something needs to be built there. When the people in that area start to move into that area, they're going to be wondering why they don't have the amenities like some other areas have. But again, the same approach I would like to see staff maybe give us some numbers to is say, okay, well, we couldn't have all of the things that we want to have in that project, but can we start with A, B, and C, and we'll do X, Y, and Z in a future time. But it starts the ball rolling. It starts the area to be used. It gives people a benefit of that. The other thing I want to mention was I've always wanted to have as much parkland as we possibly can in Richmond Hill. And I actually am quite aware that we actually have quite a lot of parkland in Richmond Hill. We don't have enough, but we have quite a lot. But I think the reality, and I would be happy to just provide this as a comment to staff, but the reality is we're likely not going to be able in any time soon to be able to acquire the amount of parkland that we have in our parks plan. That would be just my opinion. And so the reality of that is, while we've said that we need it, we've demonstrated the need for it. I don't think that it's likely even available right now. And we've had a few scenarios on this council in the last few years where, we would love to see more parkland, but we're just not likely going to get it. And so I think we need to take some consideration into that and perhaps be able to use some of that money towards some other types of things. I will say that, the other thing, and I'll just use the last few seconds that I have, I would like to know as time goes on, how much of an issue we are having with the type of exercise that we're going in and how many other municipalities are having the exact same issue. And I'd like some specifics because, Bill 23 is going to be making, and it's been shown in this presentation today, a difficult situation, way more difficult. And I think there needs to be significant advocacy. And I don't think we're the only ones facing this problem. But, the whole make us whole comment that was made, we're still waiting for that. And, we didn't get the Building Faster Fund money. And I suppose some of that money could have gone towards growth infrastructure for parks. So, this is not just a theoretical problem. This is a real problem. And I think we need to make our views known. And if you will indulge me, I did have a conversation with Councillor Liu. And he just he wasn't able to be here today, but he did say that he has some concerns about, the North Leslie Community Center being deferred, for any unreasonable amount of time as well. So I told him I would mention that. So I've used 34 seconds of his time. Okay. All right. Councillor Silovich, you wanted to speak on the second round.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Yes, just a couple of comments. Just to circle back with what Deputy Mayor Chan was saying with regards to the DDO steering committee and the DDO park. There's no question that this matter deserves a finer discussion at committee level. So I am hoping that we will have a DDO Park Steering Committee meeting in the third quarter. So this can be brought to that committee, and a fulsome discussion can be had on that level as well. I do believe that would be very, very important. And then with regards to the Civic Square, yes, I agree with everybody on that this is needed, and I hope that we can strike a Civic Square committee sooner rather than later, and in this term, so that we can begin those discussions at the very least of how we are going to approach doing something like this. I agree with Mayor West. It's an essential. As far as I'm concerned, it's essential, and we need that civic square to be another area where people can gather, and we have it. It's there. It's just sitting right now as the library grounds or parking lot. And I think we can do much more than that. And I do believe our residents would be very grateful for that. So those are the only comments I wanted to touch on. I look forward to hopefully having a DDO Park Steering Committee meeting in the third quarter. And I look forward to hopefully having a Civic Square committee struck very soon, so we can begin, at the very least, begin those discussions. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Regional Local Councillor Chan.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And I just have a couple more comments because I think staff was trying to also get a sense from us as next steps, comments. So if we were voting for scenarios A to D, I think those are being put forward to us. I would put my vote on the scenario D. I also share the view that deferring is not the best solution. It might defer upon, as Councillor Thompson may have mentioned, that we might not able to afford it. But I do see that there's only limited money. So to the extent that the scope and scale can be rescope, so we can look at that. In fact, I believe certain new growth parks, if I'm Duncan Park, just south of 16 and Young, is going to be a passive park. And that's a high growth area, considering we just are looking at 40-story here and there around the area. So that may be the kind of direction to go. And we are setting some stage on it already. And I also, on page or slide 19, I share some of the colleagues' comments not to defer further the North Leslie Community Center. The people who have been there living for quite a while, and there are more and more new residents coming in. We owe it to them. They pay taxes like any other longer residents who have been here, so they deserve it. But scaling down, like for some of the suggestion here, for the number 3, not try to micromanage, but certainly can be talking about 2 icing ring. Even like, for example, the David Hamilton Park, the second ice pad was at years after, almost 30 years afterwards. So I think those are real opportunity to look at scenario D, living within our means to extent possible. So those are basically my comments, and add on to it if we were to choose one, scenario D. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Regional Local Councillor DePaula.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. A couple extra comments based on what's been said. I think we have to remember, we're talking about major capital projects, and we want to keep it away from operational costs. Like there's two very different things, and the operational cost primarily is, the taxpayer funded money. So when you get into debt financing and other ways, the pressure's on the taxpayer, pressure's on the property taxes, whether we need to or not. They're on the hook for the debt and repaying the debt to finance capital projects. And I really hope that's my major objection to debt financing. And I hope we can keep it separate. I'm reluctant to go to the property taxes to the residents for deficiencies in capital funding and long-term capital. It's created, it's something that everyone's facing. Development charges used to cover costs of growth and used to cover infrastructure costs. They don't anymore, and it's gotten worse with recent legislation. And we're in this position, but we have great examples here of scaling down projects that real success stories. When it comes to the DDO park, we had a $78 or $80 million vision that we in our last round of financial sustainability, we reduced it to 13 or 14 million, or maybe even 11. And we're going to get that built out. It's going to be fabulous. And we found some money along the way from the federal government coming in. So we went, from 80 million down to 8 on that. The Civic Center is a great example too. We had $110 million price tag. And we're going to change that. And I agree with you, Mr. Mayor. It's time to really forward that, to go through the process and get that onto our 10-year capital wish list of things to do, because the sooner the better, but not an expensive version. There's probably in the $5 to $10 million range. We can do something there that really creates a gathering square, a sense that there is a civic center. There is a place right in the heart of Richmond Hill that we can gather and enjoy and use as a park on a very limited cost. So we made that decision not to go ahead, and we didn't know about COVID. And I hate to keep using poor region as an example, but their timing was just really, really unfortunate in building administrative offices. They were outgrowing the building that they're in, and just assuming everything would be as it always is, massively expanded, doubled their administrative office space, and they don't. There's a lot of vacancy in the existing building, and that's probably only 40 or 50% used, and now you have 80% vacancy, and the only real benefit is the courthouse that's being used. So things change, and we've really benefited from not spending the huge amounts of dollars when we seem to be in a business as usual need to make a big to do a major capital project. And North Leslie, I think, is the same thing. I think the residents in North Leslie secondary plan have Richmond Green right there. They're in the same block as Richmond Green, which is one of the best parks and community centers around. And the West Gormley people are so close to Oak Ridge, which is a fantastic community center. So I think it can wait. It can be deferred. We can re-examine the project scope. I think that's what we have to do. I think North Leslie is really the pressure that's causing us, to have this discussion. If it were off the table, we wouldn't have to have a sustainability committee. So that I think I'm saying the same thing as other councillors, but deferring, delaying, reducing the scope, I think is the way to go. But I don't want to delay the DDO anymore. I want to get the Civic Square going. Those are Those are so important, scaled down versions of what we originally thought, but they're going to be so great for our community.
Thank you. Commissioner Steele?
Yeah, through you, Mr. Chair. Thanks. I just wanted to say one thing. So if North Leslie was off the table, then we wouldn't be collecting the DCs for North Leslie, right? So you need to take that into consideration as well. So it actually wouldn't solve your problem to just take North Leslie entirely out of the equation. You'd still have the same percentage problem across the board, really.
Thank you. I mean, I appreciate the facts, but it's also illustrative of how complex this is, right? Like nothing is as simple as it might seem. Anyway, thank you for that, Councillor DePaulo. I agree with what you've said. Councillor Davidson.
Thank you. Through you, Mr. Chair. I wanted to encourage staff, and you probably are already, but looking at other ways that we can serve the community that aren't necessarily these big investments, like the pop-up pickleball at Richmond Green, I think was very well received. And we're looking at Gormley Go Station as possibly having something there. And I think maybe I'm not talking about Band-Aid measures, but something to suffice while we work out the money problems that we're all facing on municipalities. I don't want to shelve the North Leslie project, but I know that we bought our house in 1999 and the Oak Ridges Community Center opened in 2012. So I don't know what the expectation is of most, but having something right away, I don't think is necessarily what everyone expects. And if there's a way to do it at a later date and reassess and scope, I mean, I don't want to pit park against park either, because if we did, of course, Lake Wilcox would win by a mile, but I don't want to do that. But I don't know that BDO, is it more important? Is the whole thing in its entirety more important than giving something to North Leslie? That would be a tough call for me. What I do agree is with the mayor and other councillors that money spent on something we can all enjoy, like the Civic Center, makes a lot of sense. If there's a place where there are festivals or concerts and everyone can benefit from that in times of fiscal questionability, I think I agree with you there. That's a great idea, and doing it in a way that we can afford and making it exciting for residents and having a gathering place is a great idea. Those are my comments.
Okay, thank you. Anybody else? Okay, I'll just wrap up. I just wanted to make one final comment too about the comment I made about you know, the issue about acquiring more land. And again, I want to be clear. I think we should be having enough money available to us to acquire land when it becomes available. The problem is it's not coming available nearly as often as it used to. But one of the other things I should point out about that, and again, correct me, staff, if I'm incorrect on this, but once we acquire it, then what? Well, the then what is exactly what we're talking about today. We then have to program it, which adds to the costs of programming that land. So I'm not, again, this whole situation, I believe, needs to be solved by compromises, and there's no extreme example, or it's no extreme solution here that's gonna be the right thing to do, I think. And I'm hearing that, I think, from council members. I just wanted to finish off by saying, like, with regard to parks, I've never heard anybody come up to me and say, "Oh, Richmond Hill, you have terrible parks. Your total offering is just not very good." In fact, quite the opposite. I mean, we hear from people all the time. It's interestingly enough, I've heard from people. I ran into somebody at Lake Wilcox Park the other day from Toronto. She was there on a Toronto Region Conservation Authority event that I was at, and she just wouldn't stop raving about the park. And she did say how upset she was to have to pay for parking, but we both agreed that it was worth it. So I think, we have lots of good parks, and I think we need to look at our total offering and say, well, okay, all of those parks can get better over time, and we're committed to making sure that we do that. But I think we need to spread it out to make sure that all of the different assets that we have that people enjoy so much can be maximized in their enjoyment, in their use. It's important to have different parks. It's important to have parks that are accessible to lots of people, and these are some of the priorities, I think, that we need to be concentrating on right now that will bring more people into our parks and provide people the range of recreational opportunities that we need. we can't be putting all of our eggs into any basket. It needs to be distributed, and that's the kind of decision that we, along with our residents and along with our staff, are going to be asked to make. So anyway, I'll leave it there. We have a motion on the floor moved by Regional Councillor DiPaolo to receive, I believe, right? Receive the presentation and the staff report, Mr. Clerk. Okay, yep, and refer the comments back to staff. Okay, all those in favor? Opposed? That carries. And a motion to adjourn. Regional Local Councillor Chan, all those in favor? Opposed? That carries. Thank you so much. Have a good day, everybody.